Uh, 1, 2, and 3. Thank you, everyone, and greetings to everybody listening to us on this special Ahmedabad CMHS digital panel on health, wealth, and dignity towards a new social contract for India's internal migrant workers. We are essentially a motley group of uh, individuals in various spaces of life within and outside India who are trying to come together and share our observations of what happened with internal migration labor force in the last 3 months, and then offer some directions in terms of sustainable policy changes that governments in developing economies like India may want to adopt to change the normal for a better social contract with these migrant workers. Uh, we all know our panelists, but I'll just take 30 seconds to quickly introduce. We have Mr. BK Jha, who is joining from Ludhiana, and he has been working with the migrants tirelessly, offering them food over the last 3 months. Mr. Sapra, who is Deepak Sapra, who is coming from Hyderabad, and he has been helping out migrant workers to move from Hyderabad to various places around India. And he has himself transported some 3,000 migrants. We will open up the panel with them to set the context in terms of what have they observed on the field. And then we will move to Professor Anil Gupta, whose work we may all know, and especially in the context of grassroots and social entrepreneurship. And we want to have Professor Gupta's thoughts here, and then followed by Professor Rishikesha Krishnan, who is the incoming director at IIM Bangalore, who would offer some thoughts here, potentially as an observer, business school observer, on how industry can make certain changes to offer a new equilibrium, a respectable, dignity-filled equilibrium for the migrants who may have returned back home. I also want to appreciate our overseas guests, Professor Michael Spence, who is joining from Italy. We know Mike's work in information economics, but more than that, Mike is very much observing India for a long time now. He has been in Ahmedabad campus just a little while back earlier in the year. Mike is going to be joined by my colleague, by Professor Elizabeth Cobbs. She's a historian of American events, but she has some interesting thoughts to share on justice, love, and peace and equality. Along with them, along with Mike and Lisa, we have Professor Prithviraj Chaudhary, who is joining us from Boston. Prithviraj is a researcher and scholar in migration work. Some of his papers have actually studied that both in the American as well as in the international context. And they will also be joined by Mr. Pradeep Nair, who is the Regional Director for Ford Foundation India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Thank you, Pradeep, for your time. And of course, my colleague, Professor Chinmay Tumbe, who is our resident migration specialist. He has a very fascinating history book, a book on documenting the history of internal migration in India. So I really appreciate all of your time. The goal is essentially to start off the panel in a certain sequence, as I just mentioned. But before that, let me just open up the conversation by showing some quick, somewhat rudimentary and coarse, but still it may help you get some context of what has happened on the migration issue. Of course, this is not on the field, but this is what is happening in the context of sentiments for for many of us who are away from the field and observing these things and sharing our thoughts and sentiments on social media. So Aditya Bansal, who works with me as a summer intern, and myself have been studying Twitter and the sentiments around the migrant crisis. We collected about 52,000 tweets, filtering out retweets and non-English tweets. This is ongoing work. We'll do more going forward here. And this is for the period just after India's lockdown ended officially. From 8 June to 21st June, we intend to go back and do three more months of tweets. And we were able to create a machine language classifier that can classify these tweets as neutral, positive, and negative. And we are doing more to train this classifier better so that we can defend it in the context of a journal article. But what we found was, out of those 52,000 tweets, we can classify about 13,000 as positive, 5,000 as negative in their sentiments, and the rest as neutral. And if you plot this in a world map, we see that the world is watching how India is dealing with the migrant crisis, and watching with not just a neutral sentiment, but also potentially some sentiment that is siding on the direction of a negative emotion. So we see that it's a lot of reds definitely within India, but even in Western Europe or in the North America, there are folks who are tweeting with connotations that they're not happy the way India has dealt with the migration crisis. Uh, the second thing we did was we zoomed into India, and we found that a large clustering of activity in India's largest cities, but there is also a larger spread. And that is exactly why we want to now go inside this data, expand the database for the last 3 months, correlate it with lockdown policies that have been happening, and see if there is a distribution we can plot out district by district in terms of the sentiments that are panning out in India as policies have changed related to how to deal with COVID-19. And finally, we classified these tweets between verified and non-verified users. Interestingly, and this is obviously non-representative data, but it looks like those who are verified users are tweeting more positively about the migrant crisis in India. And that seems weird to us because verified users are the ones who are having greatest influence on social media, but it looks like the general sentiment around them might be on the field outside Twitter positive, or sorry, negative, but on social media, verified users seem to be saying something which is in the opposite direction. And we want to make this a little more sharper and make sure that this is rightly tested in our larger database. So with that as the context, I want to go back now to the field from social media and start with Mr. Jha to share with us his thoughts on what has he seen about the migrant workers who are trying to come back from Punjab, and what are his observations on how to sustainably address this issue. Mr. Jha, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening to all of you. I'll just share my screen because there is a small PPT that's there.
Sure.
And, yeah, thank you. And the PPT essentially is about what we did with the food helpline, but it will also explain as to what's been going on.
When you share, you have to select either in the central part of the screen, you will find application. The PPT in the central part.
Yeah.
There are three options on your screen.
Yes.
Use the PPT will show up in the central part. You open the PPT first and then select.
Okay.
Please open it first.
Or email it to me, I can open it for you.
Okay, I'll do that just now. Yeah. Well, you have a slightly technically challenged. Anyway, I'll keep talking while I'm doing this.
Sure, I'll open up.
Yeah, so that I don't take up more than my allotted time. For us, the food helpline began. I work for government, and during lockdown, almost our entire department and offices, they were all shut down. That is one. The second is that in Ludhiana, we have been running a set of schools here. 5,100 children from the slums. There are 36 schools. And in these schools, the parents are all illiterate and they were all home. The children were restless. So what we did was that we tried to begin their schools once again. And then we found that they had problems of rations, they had problems of food. So that is how the food helpline started as far as Ludhiana is concerned. And then a whole lot of public servants got together and they set up what is called a Karuna, C-A-R-U-N-A helpline, which spread its work all across India. And more than 26 government departments, thousands of government officers, they all were involved in this Karuna. What we did was we set up 6 helplines. And in the minute when the PPT reaches Professor Chatterjee, and if he can open it.
Sure.
Did you get it?
Not yet. And it has arrived. Yes, I will now open it. I will now share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Mr. Jha, can you see it?
Yeah, yes, I can. So what we did was that we used Adobe Sign to set up a system where we started getting calls from distressed people, from NGOs and others. And these would be forwarded to volunteers, and the volunteers would then carry out the food distribution activity. Now, we managed to provide food to more than 300,000 people for a period of more than 2 months. And after that, the whole process of the migration began. And when migration began, what we also did was, I'll send you one more, Professor Chatterjee. When the migration began, then what we did was that all our government vehicles that were there, we requested our officers across India to use these government vehicles to once again start filling up their boots with food and go up and down the highways, and then to distribute the food on the highways as they saw the migrants I'm just trying to send you one more PPT. Yeah. This is getting to you on Google Drive, Professor.
Okay. You want me to open that, or you want to continue what you wanted to say on these slides?
Yeah, yeah. The one that's just coming on the Google Drive, that will have to be opened because.
Okay.
Process, I mean, that's very helpful. Professor, Mr. Jha, please keep narrating the process. Yeah.
So what happened was that we had 40 volunteers who handled different regions in India. And all of these were government officers belonging to different departments. There were 12 young recruits, officers who had just joined government, who were handling a 24/7 helpline for us. And all these officers, what they would do is that they would receive a call, they would send it for verification, they would call back the distressed person, they would verify as to when they had last received the food supply, if at all, and then they would send it to the volunteers in Bombay, in Delhi, in Gurgaon, in Bangalore. We had groups of around 35 to 40 officers who managed crowdfunding. Yeah, this is the one. Thank you very much. Who managed crowdfunding, who managed collecting of provisions, who managed community kitchens, and so on. Can we go back to the first slide, Professor Chatterjee? Yeah. This is the story of the migrant. This is a scene in Gurgaon early morning. And if you can see vaguely, there is one man and his wife with he has a bundle on his head and he's walking down the empty road. And there's that big building and there's an SUV and he's leaving Gurgaon. So this is the story of the migrant, the city that he built and which he had to leave. Can we carry on, Professor? Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, these were the helplines that we had set up. And they would receive and forward distress calls, and then there would be people to service the calls. Can we go on? Next one, please. Yeah. I've just described all of this in the last couple of minutes. And the best thing was that our team grew. We covered from Assam, near the borders of Bangladesh, to Srinagar, to Anantnag, to Chennai, to Bangalore, to Rajasthan, Gujarat, everywhere. And once the migrations began on the road, and once our government vehicles were moving on the roads with food, and what they would do is they travel around 100 meters beyond where the groups of people were going. They would set down all the packets, and when they reached, they said, just pick them up, and either you eat them now or you carry them with you. And when people saw this, a lot more people started joining us. So it became a movement by the time we got down to the second week of the migration. Can we go to the next one? This is what we were doing, 15-day ration kits, which we repeated after 15 days. And then meals, water, ORS packets, oral rehydration packets, snacks, juice pouches, bananas. I think we distributed almost 250,000 bananas in these 2 weeks. Towels, sanitary napkins for the families, ointments and bandages, a lot of them needed it. And these were all served everywhere, on the highways, at the bus stations, on railway stations. We gave milk products for expectant mothers and infants and the sick, elderly homes, convalescence homes, artisans, craft persons, everyone. And then we also delivered food for a bird hospital when an SOS came. Next one, please. Yeah, this is the supply chain that we had set up on Adobe Sign. And this ensured that all our documentation as far as the delivery of the rations especially was concerned was complete. We used either government agencies, and if they were slow, then the NGOs or the volunteers stepped in. And there was a complete system where everything got logged in onto the Adobe Sign setup. The next one, please. These are some of the conversations that we had. There were people out of work. There were people out of work and out of money, and there were people on the roads. And these are the messages that were exchanged between the team members. And the ones marked red on the side are the ones that describe the situation, that a lady who works at home is out of work. Her husband is a tailor who's also lost his job, no money. Then there were cases where we got calls and the phones were switched off. So we put little recharges on their mobile phones because we realized that they had not been able to pay. We got them. And in one case, we discovered 2 little children whose mother and father had left to get medicines because the mother was suffering from cancer and she got stuck. So the neighbor couldn't look after the kids. So we got an SOS and the phone was out of charge. We recharged, and then we discovered that there were 2 little kids who were locked up inside a room. And then we got a lady who's an Anganwadi worker, as they're called, to live with them for the 2 months until their mother came back. Then people on the roads. Next one, please, Professor. Yeah. And the distribution of rations that were carried out, we called it the group of Golden Hearts, because anybody who wanted to contribute came to Golden Hearts and contributed. And we carried out the distributions in a most sanitized and safe manner. Next one, please. Again, by day and night on the highway, at railway stations, we can just keep moving. These are just visuals that I wanted to show you as to what the situation was. And these are some of the things that we did. We got a report that there were 10,000 people walking from the south, from close to Hyderabad, and they had reached the Andhra-Odisha border. So we got the person who reported to send us a geotagged map. Then we got in touch with the local authorities. We got them into a shelter. Then we supplied food to them. And in the next few days, they were all given transport, so they didn't have to walk. These are some of the little things that we managed to do. The next one, please. Just photos of the different methods and the different timings. We ran community kitchens. We stopped buses because all the buses at that time carried only migrants. There was no other, nobody else traveling. Next one, please. In the villages and the cities, the work was carried on. Next one. Again, these are some of the scenes where people's broken footwear is being replaced, people getting food in the testing centers, people are being given food at the bus stops. And in fact, one of the people, when a whole crowd of 2,000 that day was given food before they boarded buses, one of them just before getting up on a bus came to one of our officers, a lady, and said that, Madam, if we had been treated like you did treat us today, this exodus would not have happened. Whatever it was worth, it felt good, but she said it brought tears to her eyes. Next one, please. Yeah. The near future, the around 6.7 million people, as the reports say, have been stated as having returned to their native places. And 300,000 have been skill mapped, so which means that the government will be able to provide skills and perhaps the capacity to earn money in their local habitat to only 300,000. And in the meanwhile, now we have once again, after the initial lull, when people were in quarantine, we have now started receiving requests for food once again, as of the last few days, even as of today. And primarily, these are people who do not have the documents, what is called a ration card, to be able to draw on the government facilities. And then they are also saying that we are getting only rice and wheat. We need to buy oil, we need to buy spices, we need to buy vegetables, so we need money. That is one. And even though announcements have been made, and what normally happens, and as all the speakers will follow will say in much greater detail, there is going to be a vacuum, an initial lull, and that is what we will need to feed and to ensure that we bridge that gap in the crisis that might occur in the next few weeks, because the crack in the dam is visible to us. And once before the waters start flooding down once again on our hunger helpline, we are trying to prepare. The next, please. And that's the last one. I hope I haven't exceeded my time too much because of my technical incompetence, if I can put it. This is just some small steps. We spoke about the schools in Ludhiana, 5,100 children. And we've run the schools continuously. And in fact, over the last 3 years, what we've been doing is that the school education has been brought to their homes, whether their homes are clean, or whether they are teaching their little siblings what they are learning in school, ethics, values. And during this lockdown, we got the kids to teach their parents. And on the 14th of June, 376 parents sat for what we call exams, and some of them got 30 out of 30 full marks. And the happy part of it is that because we looked after these almost 2,000 families in these last 3 months, 95% of them have stayed on. They've not gone back to their villages. That is one. many families are saying that they want to put our kids into these schools, even though these schools are very rudimentary compared to the established government and private schools. But because they see the way that it's been run over the last 3 months, a number of these parents of children going to other schools want to join here. Parents who've gone back to their villages, they say that we will come back within a month and a half as soon as we can. So this is a small experiment. We call it the School of Life. In Hindi, it's called Zindagi Ki Pathshala. And there's a lot more detail in it, but I just wanted to share that this is one way perhaps that the migrants can be taken care of. If we can allow them and their families to grow roots, if we can give them education that flows from the child to the family, to the school and the teachers. We call the teachers Neel Pari, blue angels, because they wear blue saris. And it's an amazing setup that has been going on here. And the people who are doing, who are self-employed, we have been talking to the local industry to employ them. Today we've sent a list of 99 such people to one industry that has agreed to give them employment. In Bihar, we had provided rations to 181 artisan families in 4 districts. And these are the artisan families that we've spoken to try and help some of the people who have come back to create or to manufacture small things that can be sold locally. And also in Haryana, a self-help group of women has been started for the in a village there. And these 500 ladies are making spices and pickles and papads, as we call them. So little steps that are going on. Can we go to the next one, please? This is it. I'm really grateful that I have been lucky to join this absolutely amazing and distinguished group of people, some of whom I would never have dreamt of dealing with in person like this, even though it's long distance. So I'm blessed and privileged. And we'll continue this No Hunger program. We'll try and put it on an institutional basis. Lots of things are going on. Thank you very much. Please, Professor Chatterjee, across to you.
Thank you. I just have a small request for all other panelists to just try to stick to time, because we are late into the night here, but just wanted to share. So over to Deepak. I'm going to share his slides, which are not too many. And Deepak, if you could share your thoughts on what's happening in Hyderabad?
Sure. Thank you, Chirantan. So I'll be mindful of time. I just want to give a quick introduction that I actually come from a family of distressed migrants. Both my parents were part of families which were part of the 1947 migration as very young children, and therefore being distressed migrants at that point in time left an indelible mark on the way really everything happened to them in their life. So in April, May and June, I personally interacted with a lot of India's internal migrants. And what I would like to do is to share my experience on 3 things. Number 1, why did people want to leave? Number 2, the experience and the process of leaving. And number 3, what happened on reaching. So those are the 3 things on which I would like to spend a few minutes and share my experience. So on the first one, in terms of why did people want to leave, I think what I experienced was that people were wanting to leave because they did not see an end. Initially, when the lockdown happened, people thought it would be 3 weeks. However, as things kept going on and on with no clarity and no visibility in terms of what the future looks like, no one was able to predict how much time it would take for things to normalize, for some sort of economic activity to restart. I think this uncertainty had an overbearing effect on the decision to leave. In addition to this uncertainty, there were some very specific areas where people saw challenges. For example, in payment of rent, all their savings got exhausted. There were loans to be returned, which they had taken. There was a loss of daily income. And when I say loss of daily income, interacted with a lot of people such as construction workers, factory workers, domestic helps, service sector workers, brick kiln workers, who anyway go home during the monsoons. So I think a lot of people from these kind of professions had a feeling of being left out and a great amount of uncertainty which was hanging in the air. I think added to this, the lack of social insurance, the lack of social security, all of that stood out as a big gap. And more fundamentally, the fact that these kind of things happened, it eroded a lot of the trust that people had in the system, in the city, in the people that they were interacting with. And that erosion of trust really was one of the most important decisions which kind of prompted a lot of people to undertake a journey which would be difficult, which would be hazardous, and which would be fraught with a lot of uncertainties. The picture you see on the screen, this is a picture which is from the Medchal highway just off Hyderabad, from where the road leads into the rest of Telangana, eventually going to Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra. I think I put this picture up here just for one reason. On one hand, to show the challenges that a lot of people are facing. And on the other hand, I think the kind of overwhelming response that people gave, especially to children. And this is not just the parents, not just the families, but also a lot of people from people like you and me, ordinary citizens. And that to me is the most important element in this picture, which is a cause of great hope. So that's probably on the first question, that why did people want to leave? Let me now share a little bit on the second question, which is on the process of leaving and the experience during the process of leaving. So when this happened, on account of the chaos and on account of the issues around transportation, there was inadequacy of modes of transport, there was inadequacy of communication. There was also an inadequacy on the ways to access those modes of communication. In some of the efforts that we did actually involved helping a lot of people who had started to walk on the road, some of them whose homes were thousands of kilometers away, and basically saying that we will take ad hoc modes of transport, take whatever it comes and just keep moving in the May heat. A lot of these people, I had women with them, a lot of these people had children with them. Quite a few of these people were 60 years and above of age, and many of them were taking unsafe modes of transport to go home. In our own small way, we organized about 45 plus buses, which took about 1,800 people from Hyderabad to nearby states such as Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Maharashtra, and also some people to states which are far away, such as Jharkhand, Bihar, UP, and West Bengal. In addition to the buses, we also tried to facilitate the movement of people by trains, in some cases by funding tickets, in some cases by making sure that the gaps in information were plugged in, by making sure that the right reservation forms were filled, the right permissions were obtained. However, since the number of trains was not too large, and there is a large population which was keen to go, we had to transport a large number of people also by planes, by talking to the airlines, trying to get deals with the airlines so that people could go by plane and really cut short that very, very long and arduous journey. So from Hyderabad to Raipur, Hyderabad to Lucknow, Hyderabad to Patna, for some people from Bangalore to Visakhapatnam. I think these were some of the things which, some of the journeys which we facilitated people during the course of the last 2 months. Now, the reason I'm talking about it is because transportation became a very, very important issue, essentially on account of the procedures that were put in place across states. Many a time, these procedures were not aligned, these procedures were not consistent. Each state followed different procedures, and that created a challenge in wading through the permissions, the paperwork, the approvals. And many of the migrants also were digital illiterates. So things like CAPTCHA, uploading a JPG image with a certain file size, these were almost unsurmountable hurdles for a lot of people. The inconsistency of procedures at the origin state and also at the destination state actually gave the feeling that we are not living in one country, but maybe living in many countries wherein you need a visa to travel from one country to another. So that was a little bit of my experience on the transportation part. There is one particular segment, however, which even within this whole universal set of vulnerability was the most vulnerable. And these were people with disabilities, some of the people with some sort of mental challenges. Chirantan, if you could just move for a second to the next slide. Yeah, this one. So one person who actually stands out is this person who I interacted with. He's from Malda district in West Bengal, abandoned by his brick kiln owner near Secunderabad railway station. And if you notice his feet, there are two different slippers. This person has a difficulty in sleeping with no money, no phone, and just a representation of the kind of vulnerability that a lot of people like this had, almost pushed on the brink of destitution. And the overwhelming nature of this situation was very, very hard on on people such as these, and pushed a very large number of people on the edge. So that's the second set of things that I wanted to share about the process of going. Now let me come to the third part of what I want to share, which is the experience on return. Once people got to wherever they wanted to go, once people reached home, what happened? So on reaching back, I think some people had to undergo quarantine depending on the rules of the respective states. Some people managed to reach their villages, but a lot of people were not allowed within the villages. So they had to kind of spend time on the outskirts. And, but having said that, once they got home, a lot of people experienced emotional relief. It was great to be back amongst the people that they were comfortable with. It was great to be in a place where they don't have to pay the rent. And I think that provided a lot of emotional relief for some time. After some time, however, the need for economic activity, I think that came up very strongly, because you have come back to the village, and now there is you've exhausted almost all your savings in the process of getting there, in the process of surviving the last 2-3 months. So what do you do now? And I think that was a question which came up for a lot of people, and is still coming up for a lot of people that I'm currently in touch with. And some of the people have set up small businesses. One of them, for example, has set up a small tea shop in Jharkhand. One of them is selling chappals near Diamond Harbour in West Bengal. One of them has taken up employment under MGNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So I think as a lot of these things happened, a lot of people also felt the need for cash grants. And a lot of people felt the need for having some sort of a money to tide over this situation, wherein they were thrown into a cauldron of uncertainty. So specifically, let me take a minute on MGNREGA. This is a program which is very, very powerful if implemented in the right spirit. So it provides a provision not only in terms of the days of the employment, but also in terms of employing anybody who is above, who meets a certain criteria. The criteria is quite broad. But I think there is an opportunity here now with a lot of such people with certain skills back in the village to redefine the scope and extent of such programs, not just actually in terms of the provision of days of employment, not just in terms of the provision of how much you provide to them on a daily basis, but also in terms of productivity and creating meaningful opportunities. I mean, a small example, thinking aloud, a modified version of MGNREGA could possibly create thousands of rural clubs on the lines of an urban club, which many of us in India are familiar with, creating a pool of skilled resources that can meaningfully operate in the vicinity of the place where they live, instead of places where they go thousands of kilometers away. So I think those were the 3 observations I wanted to share. In closing, I want to actually leave you with this picture in which you see one of those ladies who, who was, instead of taking the journey by road, we facilitated her to go by plane and really cover that journey. She's walking confidently. So this is what I like as an example of Bharat and India coexisting. And therefore, while I think there were a lot of challenges, what stood out for me was the immense potential that the goodness of people and the goodness of citizens can bring in. The goodness of people stood out, really. This includes people from the government, people from the police, citizens from all walks of life, who made several efforts in their own way. Several organizations, students, corporate entities, educational institutions. I think that gives me hope that there is a way forward if we are able to galvanize the energy and goodness that is inherent in all of us to create opportunities in a situation like this. And I believe if we do that, it can bring about a greater, more equitable and a more progressive convergence between India and Bharat, which seem to be very, very far apart today. So that's what I wanted to share, Chiranthan. Over to you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you for giving us a cross-country sweep from the north of India to the south of India. We are definitely running late. I think we'll be 20 minutes past our scheduled closure. So if any of you have to leave, please do leave after your intervention. I will go now to Professor Anil Gupta and request him to share his thoughts. Sir, you need to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Mr. Jha and Deepak, for very evocatively explaining the stress under which the migrants had to bear with. But I must also mention a few other dimensions. One was that many of the workers are hired by contractors. And these contractors, some cases ran away, and some cases, though they received payment from the, that is, the builder, but did not pass it on to the workers. Secondly, the time that, and Chiranthan asked this question, the time given to the workers to make adjustment was too little, in fact. And the periodic extension of the lockdown made them even more impatient. They had, if the lockdown had been predicted in the beginning, maybe there would have been less migration than because of the periodic extension, the migration took place. Thirdly, there was a complete, not complete, I would say significant loss of support that was available, that was said to be available for people who did not have ration card. You know, even families which have ration cards, they leave it with the family back in the village. So when you move to the cities, you don't carry ration card with you because more people in the villages are supposed to receive it. So they had no entitlement, so to say, from the PDS, even though government declared afterward that on the production of Aadhaar card, you will get ration. Very little, very few of them got it. Not that nobody got it, many people got it, but very much fewer. Now, what is the way ahead? What could have been done better? First thing is that once we knew that the migration was taking place, the railway system should have come into play much faster, much earlier. It did come into play, but much later. By the time the distress migration had already taken place, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were on the road, and this could have been avoided. I'm happy that railways made many modifications in their rules by which they started picking up people. First, they required collector's permission, then that was relaxed. And anyway, railway department person felt that they had to stop, they would stop and pick up the migrants. But this was much later, by the time the real damage had been done. Thirdly, I would say that the possibility of industry retaining these people by offering them some concessions, I was surprised that did not take place. Even now, barring a few cases, farmers in Punjab have paid for their arrival back from the villages to Punjab for farming. That is the only case where I have seen large scale effort of employers to get labor back. But otherwise, the industry still is waiting that let them suffer, let them become more vulnerable, and then plead for the jobs back. I think this is not a very happy situation where none of the industry association has come forward to redefine the social contract, to redefine the terms at which they would like to get these workers back. This is disheartening. And I think my friends from the management school must take initiatives with the business houses and business associations and try to have a similar webinar with them and ask themselves as to what is holding them back to at least bring those workers back whom they need very badly and yet are not willing to even offer a proper compensation, proper fare for getting them back and so on. Now, one side of the distress is the other side of opportunity. Where do I see hope? Never before such highly skilled and knowledgeable people come back to rural areas in such large number. So it offers many opportunities that we are throwing away. For instance, the average number of work, even this year, now the rains are going to come, under Narega is not more than 45, 47 days. That means for last 3 years, with or without distress, we have not even reached 100 days of employment that we are supposed to provide. We are only reaching about 50%. This year again, it is less than 50%. And despite the fact the government announced much bigger budget for the purpose, it is not being utilized, it is not being utilized. So this is one major challenge that we had expected to be met, but is not being met. We still can try, and we should plead for that. Second is that there was a huge opportunity for in situ conservation of water. A lot of construction workers could have made both rooftop water harvesting structures and underground water. Large number of schools have toilets which are clogged because there's not enough water. If we had made these underground water holding conservation structures, we would have solved problem of drinking water, but also made the Swachhata mission much more functional and viable. We lost that opportunity. We almost lost that opportunity. Thirdly, a lot of these workers come from industries where they know how to make machines, how to make things. We could have given them opportunity to make small machinery for farming sector, where there's a huge need for improving productivity of labor through small machines, through small tools. And we have again not given much chance to that idea to flourish, though some of us wrote about it, and we are still pleading for that. So how can we get to a situation when the crisis can be converted into opportunity? The mapping that has started in 2 or 3 states only is focusing on skill and not knowledge. We made a small experiment, food for knowledge, under Annapurna. We said we offered the food to the laborers stuck because of the lack of job and lack of income. And we said, share with us your knowledge of survival. And this knowledge was very, very precious. And they shared some of it. We documented it. We did it in Kashmir, we did it in Ahmedabad, we did it in Madurai, we did it in Bilaspur. And it showed that many of them knew how to survive. Just one example will suffice, that whitewash workers many times cut their hand. And how do they immediately stop the blood? They use cobwebs, spider's web, which immediately coagulate the blood. If some of you have interest, go to the web and search. It is one of the most effective, faster than any medicine that we know. Now there is a precious knowledge of this kind with workers, because they have to survive with very few material resources, and they naturally have to leverage their mental resources, their knowledge resources. So I will conclude by saying that if we really wish to still salvage the situation, we should move towards a new social contract. We should ask ourselves as to why the construction industry fund was not used to rehabilitate the workers. We should also ask ourselves that 3,000 crore was given to the registered workers. Now, ratio of registered to unregistered worker is to be something that should be studied. I'm sure that some of you have done meta studies and empirical work on that. And you will know that, Chinmay might know, that a very small proportion of workers are actually registered. Most of them are unregistered workers who are hired through the contractors. So therefore, they don't get any compensation or any any way of being dealt with this crisis that is lying at our head. So I would say that we must try to register every single worker now. Second, we must make it possible for them to have PDS cards in one family can have 2 cards, one for the worker who is mobile and one for the family to stay behind. Third, we should make sure that in cases where the PDS card gets lost, ration card gets lost, the Aadhaar card should make them eligible for getting food as and when need arises, because they, even in normal times, don't get PDS entitlement. So therefore, they would need that when they come back. Fourthly, we should try to start public works in a big way wherever the time still offers an opportunity for us, and engage them in those kind of activities. Finally, I would say that if we could use this opportunity for this mapping the mind of the people, I have always said in my book, mind on the margin or not marginal mind. These workers have tremendous knowledge of surviving under odds. And if this knowledge could be made available to the larger society under a proper prior informed consent, we could generate new options for the rest of the society as well. Finally, could we still try to have a new social contract? Could we still try to negotiate with industry better terms for these laborers, so that in future, if ever any calamity comes, they will not be distressed the way Mr. Jha and Deepak have explained. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. This is quite a good filler from the events that were happening in the field. And I appreciate others who have been waiting patiently and hearing to the first 3 speakers. Over to Professor Krishnan for his thoughts, especially maybe on the business side of the story, like Professor Gupta mentioned.
Yeah, so thank you, Chirantan. I'm not going to delve too much into the migration process, because I think that's been covered quite well. I'm just going to cover a few slightly idiosyncratic pieces of information which I think have some bearing on what's going to be the future and what are some of the future challenges. If you just rewind, I think you will realize, at least in the history of industrial relations in India, the 1980 textile strike in Bombay was a kind of a very significant event. During the 80s, we also saw a lot of industrial activity in the Mumbai-Pune belt, particularly under people related to Datta Samant and other powerful trade union leaders. One unfortunate outcome of all this industrial activity, it appears, industrial trade union activity, it appears, is that when the 90s, when the liberalization process started and the Indian economy started growing at a much faster rate, unfortunately, a lot of the new employment that got created was not in the formal sector. A lot of it was either contractual or temporary, and we never actually saw the kind of growth in formal organized sector that one would have expected going along with the kind of growth of the Indian economy. So the first observation I would like to make is that a lot of the growth we've seen in the last 25, 30 years since liberalization, unfortunately, has gone hand in hand with the casualization of the Indian economy. And that's on all fronts, whether you look at infrastructure or even a company as well organized as Maruti, where a few years ago, there was a very significant industrial incident in Manesar. What is the, why am I focusing on all this? I'm just focusing on all this because when you also look at the poverty reduction figures, which have often quoted, particularly in terms of the number of people who have come out of stark poverty, you will find that again, those numbers have sort of increased quite a bit since the early 90s. But again, that group was probably similar to this group. It is the casualized labor pool who earned that money. But it's also interesting to note that how you just have one significant break like what we have seen now, and a lot of people are once again on the brink of going back into poverty. The third point I would like to mention here is that at least from what, I mean, I'm not been a very serious student of business history, but whatever I have understood of history, business history, you will find that in the developed world, at least, a lot of people moved from agriculture to industry. And that is also probably the time when a lot of growth happened in the economy. For example, in the US in the 1950s and 60s and so on. And of course, the industrial workers also earned reasonably well from that, which led to the growth of the middle class. And of course, the middle class has lost out in the last 20 years, but prior to that, the middle class actually grew quite well and did quite well. But as I kind of described to you earlier, in India, the growth from the early 90s happened largely with a casualized labor pool who continue to be much more vulnerable. So all of this brings me to the final question, which I wanted to kind of just focus on, which is what is the future? So if we assume that, you know, one important arena for growth is going to be industry. If we look at a lot of the plans the government has right now to build a self-reliant, more manufacturing-based economy, it is clear that there is going to be a need for lots of people to work in those jobs. But it is also clear that the kind of people whom the industry would like to employ in those roles are not a regular, well-paid, permanent workforce. It is actually this casualized workforce which they would like to employ. It's quite instructive. Recently, I read an article which talked about some area in Maharashtra where a lot of the migrants, of course, had gone away. But there are local people available to do industrial work. But there was a very interesting interview with some of the local industrialists where they said, we don't want to employ these local guys. And there were two reasons. One was a kind of stereotypical, oh, these guys don't work hard, which also could be seen as maybe we can't exploit them. And the second part is they will form unions. So these were the two reasons given by the local industrialists to say that they did not want to employ local workers. So anyway, what I'm trying to hint at in all of this is that unfortunately the industrial growth model now seems to consist of having non-unionized casual workers, which are really the sort of instrument of production. But at the same time, it looks like the country will be needing quite a few of these people in the years ahead to build or rebuild the kind of industrial base which India needs to grow at a fast pace. Just one more point I would mention here is about NREGA. So if you look at NREGA, when it first came into effect, there was actually some impact on construction workers availability in cities. So I remember at that time when I had visited Hyderabad, I had visited Chennai, I had visited several big cities, and even outside the construction industry, even in the auto component industry, there were worries expressed by the industrialists that with NREGA, we will no longer have workers available who can work for us. And there was a short period of time where they actually felt that. But then I think, as Professor Gupta pointed out, NREGA never really grew big enough to constitute a big enough sort of work opportunity for people. And as a result, we never saw NREGA becoming a permanent threat to people migrating to cities. So people continue to migrate to cities. And one reason why NREGA has also not taken off is because it's never really got structured around some meaningful development activities. There used to be jokes that NREGA, 1 year they'll dig the pond, the next year they'll fill the pond, the third year they'll dig the pond again. So, I mean, that's the way work was often created in NREGA project. But that's obviously a thorough waste of manpower. And I particularly like the comment of Professor Gupta that we need to find constructive work activities for people. But I must say that, at least in conclusion, I am not very confident, nor am I very optimistic that all these small businesses in villages and so on are going to be a feasible way to provide enough employment to people. If you look at some of the government's mudra loans, which they've given to small businesses, started by people, I think largely in rural areas, the delinquency rate is actually quite high. So it doesn't look as though the opportunity for running successful businesses in those locations is a very fruitful opportunity. So it looks to me that in the long run, there doesn't seem to be much option except for people to sort of go back to searching for higher paying jobs, which again looks like back in the city, because it doesn't look as though a lot of industry is going to be set up in rural India. So I think we have to look more closely at things like how do we provide better living conditions for migrant workers in cities? How do we strengthen rather than weaken labor laws to ensure that casualized workers have some minimum rights and protection? I think those are the directions on which we might have to look more carefully in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of the model of economic growth. There is a model that I teach in my class on the Lewis model, where we talk about the Lewisian turning point within the internal labor market. And this is the right opportunity for bringing in Professor Michael Spence, who is joining in from Italy, to share his thoughts, perspective, as well as what he has been observing in terms of a sustainable way forward. Professor Spence, if you are there, it's over to you.
Thank you, Sharantan. Well, it's a privilege being with you, and I've really enjoyed listening to all of you talk. Obviously, somebody like me at a great distance isn't on the ground and doesn't really have a very good sense of what's actually going on. So I'm not going to try to deal as a sort of incompetent outsider with the details of the migrant thing. So let me just make a couple of comments. I live at the moment in Italy. Italy had a very large outbreak in the north that required essentially a 3-month lockdown. Fortunately, it's a country like a number of others that could afford to devote massive fiscal resources to try to buffer the huge impact on individuals and businesses. And that has here and elsewhere worked reasonably well. I was very interested in several comments among the preceding speakers that the glitches, the flaws, are very much related to implementation and systems that just can't handle the kinds of volumes that we're dealing with in this situation. For example, the American unemployment insurance schemes, which were inundated, I would say, didn't get benefits to the people who applied for them because the people couldn't apply because the online system simply crashed. You know, if you go from 200,000 to several million people applying, these are fixable problems, of course, and I certainly think that among the lessons that we will take away from this once we get through it is a whole lot more attention and investment devoted to the resilience of the systems that we rely on, whether they're the medical system or the social safety nets in various dimensions. But to go back to Italy, the government announced sometime in early March that they were going to lock down the regions. In the Indian context, you think of those as states. One of the worst hit regions is Lombardy, where Milan is and where I live. And what happened is the night before the announced lockdown, meaning no regional movement whatsoever except for essential goods and related activity, the train station was literally overwhelmed with people heading south. So I just wanted to, you know, throw that in. So that I've read some criticism of sort of, you know, locking down without telling people, but from a policymaker's point of view, there's a very difficult decision to make, which has to do with the benefits and costs of what's going to happen when people know sometime in the next 24 hours that the gates are going to get shut. The most important thing I wanted to share with you is that there's a major project being conducted in Hangzhou in China in an academy called the Luan Academy. And I don't have time to tell you, but the purpose, a lot about it, and certainly not share slides, given the number of speakers who are insightful that need to have, you know, so have important words to say. But the purpose of this project is to track in real time in 132 countries the coevolution of the economy and the virus at the same time. And it's online, it's updated daily, and its essential features are, I think you all know, that, you know, we get massive amounts of information on what's going on with the, you know, infections and the virus, but the economic information we get is just wildly out of date. For example, we have first quarter GDP data, then a little bit of unemployment data. You know, in normal times, that's probably okay. In unusual times like this, that's nearly useless if you're a decision maker trying to decide on the pace and sequencing and the timing of opening up. And there are obviously differences among countries. So I just want to report one pattern that emerges if you go look in that data. Oh, sorry. The crucial observation that they made is that a reasonable proxy for the level of economic contraction in most economies is can be arrived at by studying mobility. It just turns out if you run a regression, it counts for about 75% of the variation across a number of economies in that. So it's imperfect. You know, it'd be nice to know what's really going on in the economy in detail, but we don't have that. So that's not, it's a non-option. So that's where so basically they track economic contractions and then some measure of to what extent the virus is under control. You see three patterns in this. One, a very small number of Asian countries basically stopped the virus before it spread. They didn't stop it completely, but they caught it so that very aggressive tracking testing, tracking, and tracing. They basically enabled them to get it under control. Virtually all the rest of us, for whatever reason, I mean, some people are critical, some people just make it as an observation, basically had the virus spread invisibly to the point where their containment via that technology, with or without digital tools, became impossible. The second pattern that you see repeatedly is across a wide range of countries, especially the developed countries, is a deep trough, a deep fall off, and then a trough, and then a gradual opening up and recovery as you say, essentially simultaneously make progress on restoring economic activity and get the virus under increasing control, which means essentially that the rate of new infections is starting to go down and eventually gets to the point where the recoveries exceed the new infections and you're actually over the peak. The third pattern, when I'm afraid I have to tell you that India is in it, is but it's not by any means unique, is a fairly large contraction and then a fairly extended period with living with that contraction without a large amount of movement in the direction of controlling the virus. I mean, if you look at these graphs, that means you drop and then you start moving to the right, but you don't move fast enough to the right. And so I think there's so if viewing it from outside, I would say that in countries that have very highly dense populations, especially in urban areas, where the normal control mechanisms like social distancing, don't work very well, are facing a very difficult situation. And it looks like to me what's happening in the Indian economy, where the contraction is declining, which means the economy is starting to recover and open up, but the infections are rising. And by the way, you can see exactly the same pattern. I won't give you a list of countries, but you can certainly see it in Brazil, and you can certainly see it in Mexico, and you can certainly see a very serious version of it in Pakistan, among others. So I think there's I admire greatly the sort of humanitarian efforts, but I think there's some really important kind of fundamental choices to be made here about how difficult choices about opening up so that people who are living at the margin don't kind of run out of resources for them and their families to stay alive on the one hand, and getting the virus under control. Now, if we had a lot of time, I guess I would, speculate a little bit about how to handle this, but I think that pattern, that pattern in the coevolution of the virus and the economy is looking like it's a major challenge. Basically, if you take me up on this offer and go look at the websites, what you'll see is that when a country is doubling the rate of infections at or sort of the number of days it takes to double the number of infections gets above about 20, the virus is under control. If it's at 10, it's out of control. And so India is right now, in this real-time data, was hovering around 10 to 12 for a while. You're now approaching 20. So I think you're at a very critical juncture where you may have finally got to the point of getting the virus under control, but an excessively rapid opening up, and especially in conjunction with a whole lot of increased mobility of people across state boundaries and just internally in the economy, will run the risk of pushing you back into the danger zone with respect to the virus, not the economy, but the virus. Tiritan, that's I think enough from me.
Thank you, Mike. I have shared the website of the Luan Academy, and for those of you interested to dig up the data, you can go out and check it out. Thanks, Mike, for your intervention. Let's go to Professor Forbes and see what she has to say from a historical perspective.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to be here with you all. And again, from being outside India, I really want to just look at, I'm looking at my sharing, share my screen, hold on. Yes, there we go. Okay, start at the beginning. Sorry about that. Okay, share that, but I'm at the wrong spot in this presentation. Okay, slideshow from the start. Okay, there we go. This crisis seems unprecedented, of course, but it is not unprecedented, and history shows it is predictable and, in fact, a harbinger of migrant crises to come for which we need to prepare. And I think that the terrible scale of the Indian crisis gives us a chance to really sort of get our heads around this problem. We really have only about 30 years because in the course of the next 3 decades, we're going to be seeing a lot more migrant crises for a variety of reasons. I invite everybody to think about where you were 30 years ago. And once you get that in your mind, you know that it's a long time ago, but it's also not a long time. So that means projecting forward 30 years, we need to think about how we can respond to crises similar to the ones that we're looking at right now. Now, 30 years seems short in retrospect, but it's better than the 4 hours that the Prime Minister gave the people of India to seek shelter. So, of course, there are different kinds of migrant crises. One has to do with disease. And this is a problem that, in a sense, is not of human creation, and I really resist efforts to, unfortunately, in my country, call it the Chinese virus because it's just a human virus. Human viruses have spread around the globe since the time of the Black Plague, so that's just the way it goes. But they're compounded by a couple of things, one of which is poor government decision-making. In the last several years, we've seen a growth of populism around the globe, and one consequence of that has been to sort of attack institutions rather than trying to strengthen institutions. In the case of India, as you see here, it's, obviously short notice for people, and this happened in our country as well, my country in the United States. But it's also poor systemic labor management that affects informal workers, and particularly women. We've all seen various tweets. It's nice to know that there were a number of positive tweets. I saw more of the negative ones. But certainly for millions of women and children, this means that the present day crisis has intergenerational or effects that can be felt across generations. And right now, several people have pointed out, and the figures that are available to me over here, there's something like 450 million Indian workers are informal workers. And that means that there is no provision for them in a moment of crises. And by the way, we experience the same thing here in the United States in terms of gig economy, which is what we call it, this sort of informal economies where people are not really a part of a larger system, which they can turn to a moment of crises. And as people have mentioned, our unemployment insurance has been overwhelmed, and there have been many people who have gotten nothing since mid-March as a result of this. So it's not simply an Indian problem. But in this case, of course, it's heartbreaking for people, as this picture shows, who are pregnant or with carrying young children. So these crises are partly a result, of course, of disease, as we're seeing in this case. Politics, however, is another way in which a crisis like this gets going. This is a famous picture from the Indian partition of India in 1947. And of course, this is a situation in which a political crisis led to a migrant crisis. But this is not simply history, it's history in the making as well. This is a picture from people from Rohingya from Myanmar flooding into Bangladesh a couple of years ago, so from 2018. And this, of course, shows that politics do create these kind of crises, and this is something for the United Nations and for all nations to be concerned about, because they always have spillover effects into other countries, in this case, Bangladesh. One can mention the Syrian refugee crisis of 2016, in which 13.5 million people were displaced in that country, and a number of them fled to surrounding countries and as far away as Scandinavia. So disease, politics are a source of migrant crises. Poverty is a source of ongoing migrant crises that we really have to think about as a globe, because they spill over to other countries. This is not a train in India, this is a train in Mexico, in which, a picture from 2018 in which Mexicans are heading north to the American border to try to attempt to get across because of poverty and also violence in their country. So that's, again, a situation where this is not going to slow down. If anything, there are conditions which are causing these kind of migrant crises to speed up. This, of course, is not just the Northern Hemisphere in the United States and the Americas. This is a picture from Libya, people coming across from North Africa into Italy just a couple of years ago. And again, in this case, of course, it's ship capsizing and people and children and women and men and old people being dumped into a bay. So that's a kind of crisis where global poverty, yes, has declined. And I thought the observation that was made by one of the speakers was very important, that poverty overall has declined, but one of the things that's happened is a greater informalization of the economy that has accompanied that. So we've not yet engineered adequate systems to deal with the fact that our economy has changed profoundly, and in some ways in good ways, but in other ways, in ways that put people in harm's way. Lastly, there are the environmental crises, which is one reason why I say we have 30 years to prepare for this, because there are two factors of global warming, one of which is the spread of stronger storms. This is a picture from Bangladesh in 2019, just last year, where terribly strong storms, I think this was monsoon season, led to massive flooding. This is from the United States in 2005, Hurricane Katrina. So this is a picture of New Orleans. And in our country, where the levees that were constructed decades before broke, had not been properly maintained, because again, as time goes on, these systems have to be rejuvenated. They can't just be left to sit. And these stronger storms mean we're going to have migrant crises. This is a picture from, I teach in Texas, and this is a picture from Houston in 2017, where, as you see, everybody trying their best to get out of Houston on the approach of Hurricane Harvey. Now, these people, luckily had cars, but you see some of them walking along the side of the road because their car runs out of gas. So even in wealthy countries, we really are going to be facing displacement of people because of storms, but also because of rising water levels. These are some projections that were recently developed using artificial intelligence here in the United States, and looking at how inundation is expected to proceed over the next 30 years. On the left, you see the previous prediction of what was going to happen to Vietnam during high water moments, with most of Vietnam being flooded. On the right, you see now the current updated projections of Vietnam in 2050, which is almost the entire country being essentially lost. Now, to bring it home a little closer to people, my colleagues here in India today, these are projections on the left previously for 2015 of what would happen in India and to Mumbai in particular, a city built upon islands. And then on the right, the current projection for 2050. So even though this is a center, an engine of Indian growth, it's not stable. And that's the reason why we have to put our heads around these things. Now, all of this is just a historical trend. It's not a particular person being a bad guy. What you see here are climate data from NASA, the United States National Aeronautic and Space Administration, showing atmospheric carbon levels over hundreds of thousands of years and what's happened since 1950. It's just dramatically different, measurable. Now, this, in a sense, is kind of an irony, because that pollution, you might call it, is a result of what's happened in terms of industrialization and the industrial revolutions and agricultural revolutions of the early 19th century, which led to huge population increases, as you see, from 10,000 BCE after about 1800, population, especially 1900, beginning of the last century, really went up. Went up in some places higher than others. The curve was more dramatic, as you see here in China and India, both for reasons. First of all, those are places which started with more people than almost anybody else thousands of years ago, but have also just dramatically increased, which makes those populations particularly vulnerable. So what are our options going forward? This is something I think we simply have to wrap our heads around. It's not an option for us to think about this or experience it or not experience it. So some options are to routinize evacuation plans, and we heard a beautiful description earlier about what has been done on an emergency basis. And I do think the human spirit, it's a moment where we can observe that and take comfort from that. So, but we need to routinize these kinds of plans. We need to relocate housing in cities, perhaps entire cities, to higher ground. Slow the growth of carbon emissions to try to bring down those numbers or moderate them. We talk about flattening the COVID curve. Well, there's another even bigger curve we got to be worried about. And to rewrite the social contract to include everybody. It's going to be hard to know how to do that, but I know that humanity can do that. We've done that before. Because the alternative is simply more frequent and larger migrant crises. This is not, hasn't been our first, and it's not going to be our last. I like to end with Gandhi, and Sharantan gave me the charge of speaking on justice, love, peace, and equality, I think, which wasn't how I thought about my presentation, but I do think it's very important historically to think in terms of inspirational leaders. For me in the United States, Gandhi had a profound effect on my country because of his spread of the model of nonviolent resistance. But I go to this particular slide because I note that it was just about 100 years ago in 1921 that Gandhi adopted the dhoti, the dress of people in poverty, basically to say we're all in this together. Not everybody has to adopt this, and he encouraged not all colleagues to do so. But the point is that we're in this together, whether we like it or not, because this is the future. It's not somebody else's future. We'll all either be more impoverished, whether it's financially or morally, by seeing people around us perish, or we'll live in a world we don't recognize unless we get busy. So I think that this, I like to always conclude optimistically because I am an optimist, and some of the stories that you've shared made me feel more optimistic. But I really think it's a matter of getting our heads around the size of the problem. And if we do that, we can and we will pull together rather than pulling apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and appreciate you bringing in the father of the nation into the conversation. Professor Chaudhary, who has been patiently waiting for us from Boston, over to you, and maybe you can share your thoughts on migration.
Sure. Thank you, Chirantan, for inviting me. I've learned a lot just listening in. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
So I'll quickly go through a couple of studies, but I must caveat that though I study migration, most of my prior work has been studying migration of knowledge workers. But I'm going to share with you a study, an ongoing study that Chirantan has actually already seen on migration patterns, which are more sort of in the spirit that we are talking about right now. And the story that I'm going to try to leave at a high level is that if you look at the two tails of the distribution of human capital, there might be very different implications of how COVID-19 and this crisis affects migrants in the right tail and the left tail. So let me start with the more conventional story. So of course, I don't have to explain to this group that food security is a huge issue and migrants are suffering. Let me go directly to the research question. So what we study in this working paper is how do food security policies, and Professor Gupta talked about the ration card and a ration card linked to Aadhaar. That is what we're going to study here. How does that affect the mobility of migrants during and just after the COVID-19 lockdown? So I think this group knows very well that, ration cards were initially tied to your hometown, and then now they're being tied to Aadhaar, where people can now use the ration card, both inside the state if you're a migrant from one sub-district to a different sub-district, but also potentially there's going to be a more national implementation of portability that is being talked about a lot, and the Supreme Court actually also has been very, very sort of driven about interstate portability. So what do we find in this paper? We collected movement data using mobile phones for about 38 million Indians. And we tracked their mobility in the few days before the lockdown and a few days after the lockdown. And we are looking at three things here. We are looking at whether portability of ration card within the state affects the movement, whether portability of ration card between states affects the movement, and then beyond the ration cards, how does the activism of civil society actors distributing food, like the first gentleman mentioned, how does that affect movement? What do we find? In a nutshell, what we find is that intrastate portability is correlated to a reduction in movement. So presumably people, the explanation we attach to this finding is that the migrants do not have to move back to their home sub-district to get food. And so this is an effect that we find very strongly in states such as Andhra Pradesh, which have adopted intrastate portability almost 4 years back. We found actually interstate portability has no effect on movements, and this is borne out by data that has been shared with the Food Ministry on how little has been the uptake of interstate portability of ration cards. And then, as you would expect, we find activities of local ration shops and civil society actors beyond and above the ration card itself, the portable ration card, being correlated with movement reduction. So I'll give you two quick examples. So civil society actors, we all know about the food kitchens, and the Sikh community has been very, very active. The ration card activism is essentially something where, like, I'll give you one example. In Purbo Bardhaman in West Bengal, the district magistrate said, let's give ration to people who have applied for a ration card but have not got it. So these are the instances we picked from studying local newspapers all over the country, and that's how we construct the measure of activism. So the sample again is we're looking at movement between sub-district dyads, and then we, as to sort of like separate a simple correlation from something which is slightly more causal. We cannot claim causality here, but we use coarse and exact matching, where we are matching sub-district dyads based on the pre-lockdown data. And then we are using that coarse and exact matching specification to test whether having a portability in a dyad is correlated to movement reduction beyond compared to a dyad where there is no portability. And we find that for the intrastate context, but not the interstate context. And I'm going to skip the machine learning analysis and the robustness checks. We find a similar correlation for ration shop activism and civil society activism. So that is what we find in the left tail of the migrant population, that yes, if you provide food security, at least in the intrastate context, there seems to be some correlational patterns that seem to work with people not having to move and endanger themselves in terms of their health. I'm going to also share a study on the right tail of the distribution, and I'll make a connection between these two studies at the end. So as we all know, like any other country, India has witnessed an agglomeration boom with lots of migration from the smaller towns to these large hubs. And what I study in my research is IT hubs. But India is, of course, made up of many, many, many small towns. And so the question that I asked in this paper is, what happens to the productivity of IT workers if they remain in the small towns versus if they go to a place like Bangalore? And to do that, I worked with an Indian IT organization which randomly assigns its workers to 10 production centers, because then I can really say something causally. And in a nutshell, I'll tell you what I find in a minute, but there are two countervailing forces here. So maybe the worker is more productive if he or she goes to Bangalore, but maybe it is also possible that there is a greater risk of a competitor of the firm hiring that or poaching that worker if he or she goes to Bangalore. So if you net those two effects, what we find is the value to the company, the technology company, is almost equal if the worker went to a Bangalore production center or a small town production center. So, and when I discussed these findings with the company, they found it really interesting because it is cheaper to build these smaller town production centers. And the last thing I'll say is, and then I'll make a connection between these two studies. Post-COVID, I've been having lots of discussions, even with companies in India like TCS. I'm working with TCS on this fascinating project where this IT giant with more than 500,000 employees has now decided to become 75% remote within 3 years. And what they have decided is they will allow people to live in small towns. And I was actually talking to a group of TCS workers a few days back. They're all based in Chennai, and now they want to go back to Kumbhakonam or Nellore or Erode or other smaller towns all over India. So the implication is maybe this is a long drawn process where this might happen, but if indeed the IT workers and the sophisticated knowledge workers do spread out to the smaller centers, the smaller towns because it's either less risky for the company from a poaching point of view, or because now companies like TCS are doing remote work, maybe then the workers on the left tail do not have to go, the construction workers. There'll be more construction activity in the smaller towns. There'll be more service industries in the smaller towns. There might be more hospitals and schools in the smaller towns. And I'm not claiming this is going to happen overnight. As Rishi said, even Narega was not a substitute for employment in the cities. But if this phenomena becomes widespread, who knows, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, we will see lesser migration in both the left and the right tails from these smaller towns to the cities. And people can live close to their villages and towns and have much better food security and connections with their family. So I'll stop there. But I've learned a lot, and thank you again.
That is very fascinating, Professor Chaudhary. Thank you very much for sharing your findings on both the tales. Mr. Nair, you have been very patient. I guess you have a daily busy day tomorrow, so over to you to share the perspectives from Ford Foundation.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a long day, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I should also remark that Professor Spence and I happened to be on the same panel early this year in IIMA-Ahmedabad, and so this is the second time I'm interacting with him this year. So in more ways than one, this is truly an unusual year. So I think one of the advantages of going towards it being at the end of a panel discussion is that most of the points have already been covered. So I will be mindful of that and maybe draw out a few things that may not have been covered and may also be slightly tangential to the conversation, but nevertheless, I think it's important to share that. So for those of you who know the work that the Ford Foundation does, we're a private foundation that focuses on primarily grant making, not implementation, but grant making. And very interestingly, even before this crisis had started, in this region, we had decided last year itself that besides the work on gender equity and farmers issues that we already had a focus on, that we would also work on informal workers as a group. So this was last year, before any of this had even played out. So when this crisis did happen, we were in a sense prepared, because we already had started putting together a strategy to address the concerns and issues that we both saw and we anticipated that the informal sector in India faces. For those of you who may not be aware, and hopefully all of you are, India does, irrespective of how you define informal workers, does have the largest percentage of informal workers in the world, which then obviously also translates to the largest number of informal workers in the world. And for us, primarily the issues were mitigation, in that we are trying to address issues that we think they would be facing in the future. And also, the way we look at addressing most of these issues as a private foundation is long-term outcomes. So we are more interested in the let's wait it out and invest in systematic and structural changes to address some of these issues, which may take a long term. So the issues that we were particularly concerned about, and I think several of you have spoken about it, and I'm interchangeably using informal and migration workers here, because in a way I think, unless I'm wrong, 100% of the migration workers, people who are migrating, are in subset of the informal workers. So the way we, the issues we were particularly concerned about the informal workers were by definition the informality of the sector, the lack of social security benefits, the lack of health benefits, the lack of social contracts, any kind of contracts and agreements between the employer and the employee. Now, it is interesting that when this crisis did start to unfold, and we got pulled into several conversations by government agencies, by the private sector, by the organizations on the ground who were more, interested in addressing the humanitarian issues that these workers were facing. What was interesting to see was that the similarities in the issues that both the unorganized employers in the sector that employed these migrant workers face, and the organized sector that employed these migrant workers. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So on one hand, we were having conversations with associations of industries or some representation of these association of industries, which usually comprised of very unorganized employers, right? And we all know who they are, very small enterprises that employ these workers without, with complete disregard to any benefits, so to speak. But on the other hand, and these conversations were equally vocal and equally trying to draw attention and pleading for help, were these large organizations that by all definitions would qualify as organized and maybe even well-funded. So these were your, in Indian terminologies, unicorns and startups, and and we know who those are. And just to name some, the Swiggies and the Ubers and all these large employers who were also hiring and had hired a large number of these workers, and were now in a situation where they were having these workers whom they were not able to pay or give benefits to, also wanting to move out from these urban areas or wherever it is that they hired them back to their native place. And we were struck because for the longest time we thought the issues that we were trying to address around social security and all the other benefits that I mentioned were mostly because of the nature of the employers. And so for us, I guess this has been the learning that the organized sector also faces the exact same situation. And it has made us go back to the drawing board in a sense to kind of really relook at what are the ways to mitigate these problems moving forward. Because as much as we are inclined to support initiatives that the organized sector is reaching out to, a part of us also makes us feel a little, a little, what's the word I'm looking for? A little guilty that we would be supporting these well-funded organizations to take care of their own employees, whose benefits they should have addressed through contracts when they were hiring them. So for us, this is a new learning in this whole, that this crisis has introduced. But nevertheless, I think we still, for us, the focus has still been not necessarily on the humanitarian support that many of you have shared, which I think is equally important. But for us, because like I think Professor Spence predicted, and I hope it is true that this will pass, hopefully sometime this year, is that maybe the migration, will reverse. Maybe some part of it will reverse, but the issues that led to it is still going to remain. And these issues, like I said, are not structural and systematic, and unfortunately, I think are going to be things that will require a long-term involvement. And for us, those are the bigger issues to address. And we've seen that it's very difficult for people, even during this crisis, to get them excited enough to think about those long-term solutions to these issues. Everyone seems to be, and rightly so, I think, more fixated on the immediate resolution to these issues, but with very little concern for what is causing this in the first place. Now, very interestingly, the one migration issue that we have been working with and are used to through our programs help address is actually the migration issues that is exact reversal of this, very interestingly, which is the migration issue of, and I forget, someone I think spoke to that on this call, is the migration issues that exist from rural to urban areas, right? Whether it's because of calamities or natural disasters or conflicts or climate, or for, as for jobs or whatever. And that's an issue that we have been trying to address because we have a large program on how to increase productivity in the farming sector. And so we have a lot of lessons learned in a very reverse kind of migration over the years and decades, where we know that migration has been happening from the rural to urban areas for very completely different set of reasons. And it's fascinating how the problems that we were trying to address there are quite distinct from the ones that we are trying to handle now, because we thought we could actually draw upon those learnings, but they're very, very distinct. And that for us also has been quite a revelation. And, at some point, I'm more than happy to share with you how distinct they are in that, the issues, the solutions we have put together in place, which earlier we very foolishly thought could be just, replicated and applied to this current migration crisis has not served us of much use at all. So, but that is the one migration issue that we are actually familiar with. This is, honestly, in some way completely caught us off guard in that, it is a migration that is in large numbers. It is, I think, very conservative numbers also. It's in 130 or 140 million or whatever. Still smaller than the larger group of informal workers, which is, I think, close to 500 million or something, but nevertheless, still large enough for people to be concerned. We are, throughout civil society organizations that we support, both in rural areas and in urban areas, trying to look at how to, whether it's skilling, we're having conversations with the government as we speak in putting together skilling platforms for these people who have gone back to their rural areas. So we are working on skilling programs with the government. We are working on making available cheap debt to individuals and enterprises that may start up in these rural areas that might need access to cash. So we're working on several initiatives across the board. But, a part of us still believes that these solutions, whether it's cash, whether it's jobs, are not necessarily either addressing the systematic issues that has led to and will probably lead to more of such migrations, nor is it necessarily going to be a long-term solution for some of these issues. And for us, these two aspects to the solution that we are providing concerns us a lot. The last thing I'd like to say, very to the, adding to what, I forget who said there, but someone on the call did talk about TCS. Very interestingly, the TCS lessons and, I guess, experiments, so to say, on how to move workers back to their, to give them the flexibility to be anywhere in India and work from anywhere in the region, is actually being played out also in the social sector. Now, just for reference, and because I know we don't think about this every time when we think about the social sector, but depending on how and who defines the social sector, very conservatively, the social sector in India employs, very conservatively, 7 million people. That's more people than the IT sector or the auto sector employs, right? So it's very conservative estimates of 7 million. And if you ask people to also count the volunteers and everyone else, it comes to close to 20 million people. So let's take an average and say there's about 15 million people employed in the sector. So the same, the same things that you're seeing being played out by TCS, asking and in fact encouraging their employees to be placed anywhere when they, as long as they're able to contribute. We're seeing that this particular crisis has also introduced this flexibility to the social sector in being able to be based out of anywhere and being able to work anywhere. In fact, I would so go far as to say that that particular distributed model of working from anywhere has actually been a strength during this crisis. And so what do I mean by that? So when we were trying to, during the initial days of this crisis, when we were trying to put together, like I said, funding platforms with financial institutes and government, where we would make money available to these migrant workers or to anyone else who needs it, especially in the rural areas, we face a very practical problem of how would we get the money in someone's hand, because there was complete lockdown. So who would be, how would we actually get the money from one place to another? That's when we realized that having a distributed model where now the employees of some of these organizations, rather than being based in these large urban areas, who were back in their places because they had a structure that enabled them to work there, were acting as, in a way, quote unquote, couriers for also doing some of these services. So, and for us, this is very encouraging, because we do think this particular, in a way, this new structure that has come up in the social sector will enable us, hopefully, in these issues that we're trying to address, both for the migrant workers as well as a host of other issues that we've always associated as a challenge for this last mile delivery of services. So for us, again, just to remind you, we're talking about anywhere from 7 to 5 million people, 15 million people employed in the sector, who now all of a sudden have realized that a very distributed model of being placed and being able to work in different parts of India can necessarily be used as a strength. I have a host of other things that I wanted to share, but I'm going to stop here because I realize it's pretty late in the night for those of us here in India, and I want to be mindful of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think you can share your thoughts. We have the last word now from my colleague, Professor Chinmay Tumbe, and he has a fascinating book on India moving and its history of internal migration. And all of you can actually share your thoughts over email, which will help us build the policy note. Chinmay, the last word, and over to you.
Hi, it was great to listen and learn from all of you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I'll just start by talking about, within the gloom of this unprecedented migration crisis in India, and I call it unprecedented because even during the partition of India, the trains actually ran. I think, what I'd like to touch upon is some of the more positive elements and to argue that you can actually respond to a pandemic in a very, very smart way to minimize casualties, both in terms of deaths and economic damage. And the starting point for that would be a place in India in the south called Kerala, which is not known for its economic success over the last 5 decades. About a fifth of its workforce heads out to the Persian Gulf. But what it has managed over, I would say, 150 years, this is from my vantage point as an economic historian, is a phenomenal system of public health. This is not India's first pandemic. India's had at least 3 pandemics before. Cholera in the 19th century, plague, which killed about 10 million Indians, and of course, influenza in 1918, which wiped out 20 million Indians. More people died in influenza than global battle death toll of World War I. In all those pandemics, Kerala was unaffected. It is not chance, right? Kerala was not affected, 100 years back. It barely affected now. There's a particular systemic response that comes to a health crisis, right? That requires anticipation, that requires planning, in which Kerala, in a way, had to face an epidemic of the Nipah virus 2 years back. So the health system already knew exactly, what measures had to be rolled out. They also dealt with the migrant crisis very, very cleverly. And I'll just talk about that. The minute they realized that there's a huge pressure or need for migrants to go back, they went all out to ensure that, migrants had the best that they could do. And they were very simple and sort of, simple strategies. One, they realized that if this is about buying time, in the sense that the lockdown is about not doing anything and sitting at, sitting in a particular camp or sitting in a construction site, how do you spend time, right? And they realized, of course, the mobile phone is the most important thing. And so they ensured that all the camps that they were sort of, all the sites where migrant workers were staying got basic mobile chargers and had access to full sort of mobile services. The second thing that they realized is migrants love their home food, just like all of us. And they said, so they started providing meals, North Indian meals in South India, in order to cater to migrants' preferences. Right? So basically creating a sort of home kind of environment out there. And third, they gave carom boards, which is this remarkable sport in India where you can spend a lot of time on. These are really simple strategies to enforce a lockdown. And so you didn't really see the massive protests that we saw, for example, in Surat, for example, in Bombay, where governments were completely sort of, thrown out of gear. Having said that, despite all the good measures that they took, a lot of people still wanted to go back. And so this brings me to the point of, what is the psychology of migration in India? I have argued in my book that India is the world's longest and largest voluntary migration system. It started from roughly the late 19th century. Much of India's migrations today can be traced to those particular migrations which started then. These are circular migrations where people come and they also go back and return, especially at the time of retirement. Once you spend your entire life outside, there's a very core psychological element of this. It also means that there's a very strong psychological element of dying in one's native place. Right? And this is what happens in a health crisis. That is, if there's a scare of death, you might as well want to die in your native place. And that's why you'll hear a lot of people saying, "Marna hi hai, to gaon mein marenge." That is, if it's anyway going to come to that, I'd rather want to go back and be with my family. This also comes to this point that while the migrant sees the city as a point of economic security, it is really the village which provides social security, both in terms of family, but also in terms of public services, like Professor Gupta said, in terms of the PDS system and so on. What I'm arguing is that irrespective of how good relief work is, which it should be, people will still want to go back during a crisis. Let me just share you, a particular image. This is an image from the plague, Bombay in 1897, very similar to scenes that you'd see, in trains in India even today. But note that even then the trains sort of work. Today, of course, we saw people walking simply because the trains did not work. The minute the crisis hit 100 years back, people left for their homes, even in places where relief was sort of given. You saw this in virtually every health crisis. You've even seen this in industrial recessions, which have hit not all of India, but particular centers where people go, and they, of course, eventually come back. Now, this is a map to tell you about where people move from within India. This is data from 2007-8, but I would argue that the same hotspots exist even today. The red spots basically tell you the hotspots of out-migration. These are places of India which are sending people out. And not surprisingly, a lot of the Kerala, for example, in the south, which is here, is sending people outside India to the Gulf, whereas Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, coastal Orissa, are some of the big centers which send out migrants. Now, this is not new. This has been happening for a long time. What I want to argue is that when we say that the lockdown was announced, a lot of people say that the migration crisis of India is sad, but nobody could have anticipated it. And what I want to convey is that a lot of migration, or a lot of what we know in migration actually did come out over the last 10 years. Maps like these, but I'd also argue that the same government, the same political party in power, came out with an economic survey 2016-17, which argued that there were so many migrant workers in India, much more than the existing numbers. There was a working group on migration formed by the Ministry of Housing and Poverty Alleviation. I happen to be a member of that committee. There was a whole series of recommendations given by the committee. Some of them are slowly being implemented, like the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme. But the broader point that the government did not know anything about migration is not correct. Right? So the government definitely knew. And this brings us to the question as to why such a stringent lockdown without any planning for migrant workers was taking place in the first place. And the answer to that is to spread to contain the spread of the virus. And I think this is an important sort of point, one has to engage with. That is the epidemiological side of it that, has a very pure focus on curtailing the number of deaths. Takes this view of a complete shutdown potentially being very effective in curtailing the spread of the virus. Of course, now we've seen that logic doesn't work because 2 months after the crisis, when the infection rates are much higher, actually we allowed now migrant workers to go back. So that original logic, for whatever reason it was conveyed, anyway did not hold. But I think there are very pragmatic reasons for in the future, if similar crises appear, why we should be giving about a few days window for migrant workers to go back. A, the infection rates are much lower. B, the holding capacity of migrants in the cities is virtually minimal, and their pressure to go back is very high, right? Which means it's almost impossible to contain migrant workers in the cities, and so it's better if they go earlier than later. Third, and this is very important from an economic perspective, we've actually now delayed India's economic recovery because the migrants have gone back at the same time that they were supposed to be here, right? So because they have now gone back after the lockdown, precisely when economic activity is supposed to be starting gradually over the next few months, they're not yet back. So whatever economic recovery is supposed to happen after lockdown in India will be much more delayed than other places. I think so. There are a lot of pragmatic reasons why future lockdowns have to give a lead time for migrant workers to go back. The alternative would be to contain migrant workers in cities and give a lot of relief. But I would argue that given our history and realities, that will simply not work, right? And which sort of brings me to this point of the railways. Deepak has a nice a book on this, by the way, on the railways. The railways is not just a means of transport in India. It's it's a symbol of hope for millions of migrant workers. So shutting down the railways in the manner in which it did actually added to the shock waves of migrant workers whose whole lifeline was on the railways. I'll also add that a couple of things about the lockdown hurt the migrant workers very hard in terms of this notion of justice. For example, you shut down public transport, but there is no equivalent shutdown on private transport, which means if I had a car, I could still drive around my city or even go from point A to point B within a city. But for the migrant worker who does not have access to public transport, it was really cruel because you could not even go within a city from point A to point B without walking long distance. And I think that was, I think public transport at some capacity at least has to be facilitated. This sort of a complete lockdown, I don't think works in a context like India. The second aspect about a stringent lockdown in India, vis-a-vis say in the US or in Italy, someone pointed out this huge percentage of unorganized workforce. But I would like to talk about nutrition. I think what epidemiologists who have been advocating a hard lockdown have missed out is that, for example, now people are saying that India has saved about 60,000 deaths because of the stringent lockdown. I think that sort of benefit sort of calculation misses out the cost of pushing in millions of people into undernutrition and a lot of infections, not COVID, but other infections which ply on reduced body immunity. For example, even before COVID, India didn't really have a great sort of scorecard on communicable disease. About 1,000 people die in India every day from tuberculosis, for example. Another 1,000 die every day because of diarrheal sort of diseases. These were never really so much, these diseases didn't get as much attention as COVID-19. And so from the perspective of the poor, especially migrant workers, there was this added injustice, view saying that this COVID-19 is a rich person's disease, right? Because it's come from outside India. In the initial stages, it seemed like it was affecting rich people. So why are we being punished? Why are we being punished for somebody else's disease? If you can drive your cars, why can't we go back home by trains? So I think the migration crisis of India reflects a lot of inequities in terms of shutting down public transport, but not private transport, of taking the COVID-19 crisis at a completely different scale compared to India's existing realities of tuberculosis crisis, of varieties of diseases, and this idea of this fact that pushing people into sliding down the economic ladder has serious health implications which are unrelated with COVID-19, but that also has to be factored in the literature on health. I'll just end with this slide on growth and inflation, the standard macroeconomic indicators. The worst year in the last 118 years of Indian history was this year 1918. And we know what 1918 was. It was a year of the influenza, which, as I mentioned, wiped out 20 million Indians. We're saying GDP fell by 10%, inflation surged. I think it's very interesting that 100 years later in 2020, we are actually again going to see the numbers slide anywhere between -5 to 10 or -10%. So the two worst years in Indian economic history in the last 110 years have been caused by pandemics. And which also tells me that, we really don't know how to deal with the pandemic, especially its economic costs. And so there are a lot of learning has to happen as to how to minimize the economic damage to the country, because the economic damage also has a massive health cost. And I think that's what I really want to emphasize out here. All right, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chinmay, for wrapping it all up with a historical perspective, especially from within India, and also starting with Kerala as a model. I will not take the onerous task of summarizing all that you guys have very patiently shared in the perspectives here. My next job is to close this conversation. Thank you very much for staying patient on this panel today. We have stretched much beyond our scheduled time, and to follow up with you all on our promised policy note in writing, building on this conversation. Please stay safe and take good care. And thank you again for joining us today and being patient with us despite the time stretching that we have done on this panel.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, Chirantan.
Chirantan.